Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. Let me start by saying in past years, I've had no hesitancy because of the lack of recording in noting that the attorney-client privilege does not apply to my remarks. It doesn't apply this year either, but because I'll be speaking spontaneously, if I say anything that any of you think that, maybe he should have phrased that differently, please post that in chat and I will attempt to correct it or sanitize it if I can, because I can assure you this recording will in fact be evaluated by PG&E and used as best they can for their own purposes. As I think everybody feels, this has been a very frustrating year. None of us have ever been through a pandemic before, and watching its impacts on the regulatory process and on the governance process has been challenging. As David indicated, in February, we had a lot of meetings in Sacramento. We thought that we had done a good job in updating our various legislative representatives to what the current state of affairs at the plant was. I will say, even then, we got the cold shoulder from the governor's office. And in retrospect, I think that was more significant than we may have realized at the time, because each of our experiences in major cases this year have tended to reinforce that. That's unfortunate. I think it's been determinative in the outcomes of several proceedings this year. But these things go back and forth over a 4-year administration. And we remain hopeful that next year, and as we get closer to his re-election year, we'll have a more receptive audience in the governor's office. When the pandemic hit, we had several cases pending. The general rate case, which David has described, where our principal focus was on trying to force PG&E to justify the economics of continued operation of the plant. We had submitted testimony the year before, which PG&E has never disputed in terms of the numbers, indicating that by the PUC's own measure, the plant operates at a very substantial margin above what the PUC calculates to be the fair market price of electricity. In 2020, according to PG&E's own estimates, that's more than $1.25 billion above market. And projecting that forward, if the plant runs to its retirement date, that will be in the $5, $6, or $7 billion above market just going forward. So you ask yourself, does it make any sense to run an uneconomic plant? Setting aside the safety or reliability considerations, by traditional utility regulatory practice, the signal would be sent that this plant really needs to be evaluated as to whether it makes any sense to continue to run. So that had been our principal focus in the general rate case. We had also reached what we felt was a positive endpoint on our participation in the decommissioning case. Our focus in decommissioning had been to accelerate the transfer of spent fuel out of the liquid pools and into dry casks. That had been a position that the State Energy Commission had recommended back in 2008 and PG&E had resisted for the ensuing 10 or 11 years, with a brief period 4 or 5 years ago where they'd actually tried to accelerate the transfer and be consistent with the state recommendations. We'd resolved the decommissioning case at least prior to commission decision with a settlement that had gotten PG&E to agree to slice $300 million off of their fuel storage budget, and in bidding for new casks to specify a period of cooling in the pools that was 4 years in duration, which compared to 11, or in some instances 12, which they had previously estimated. So we felt pretty comfortable with the status of our agreement with PG&E. That case is still pending, and for most of the year, the general rate case was pending. The impact of the virus on the PUC has been to slow everything down. We're hopeful that the decommissioning case will be resolved early in 2021, and we anticipate that the settlement will be approved in 2021. There's no material opposition to it. With respect to general rate case, as David said, that was decided just this past week, and we lost. Despite our testimony, and despite the fact that the PUC sent us to 2 different forums to try and find a place where cost effectiveness could be evaluated before being sent back to the general rate case by official commission decisions. In the final analysis, the commission decided, well, so what? PG&E says the stator repair was justified for safety purposes, so there's no need to look at whether it was a cost-effective decision or not. I think as a matter of law, that is probably wrong, but one of the things the courts do in California is extend a great deal of deference to PUC determinations. So it is not worth a challenge.
Are you able to get anywhere?
I've got him.
And
Oh, great.
denouement in the general rate case raises, I think, that the futility
Let's just address this. Mark Skinner, can you please mute?
which we experienced earlier in the year. After the pandemic hit, we filed an amicus brief along with the San Luis Obispo Mothers for Peace to a different PUC decision related to this above market subsidy. Our point was in conjunction with an organization called Planning Our Communities, which was the lead appellant in the case. Our point was that the PUC did not have statutory authority to apply this form of subsidy to PG&E owned generation. The appellate court denied the appeal without issuing an opinion. And it's within the authority of the appellate courts to do that. The main appellant, Planning Our Communities, had felt that its primary problem was being forced to file in San Diego, which it considered to be a very conservative appellate panel. But you have to take these cases at where you find them. I think the brief that Mothers for Peace and the Alliance filed was a very compelling brief. I believe it's on our website, and I'd encourage any of you that are curious to take a look at it. It does lay out both the statutory argument and the cost effectiveness argument in pretty simple terms. But as I indicated, the PUC has chosen to ignore that, and the courts generally defer to commission determinations on that. So I think that we're stuck for the time being above market level, probably likely to exceed $1.25 billion each year between now and whenever the plant finally shuts down. This thing that David mentions in terms of the stator is potentially the beginning of a collapsing line of dominoes, quite similar to the steam generator outage at San Onofre in 2012. The fact that it's a non-nuclear part of the plant doesn't really matter. Old equipment fails, and quite often when you try and replace old equipment in an old plant, you don't really get it right. And in this case, it's not a 100% new stator, it's a refurbished stator. Certain parts of the refurbished stator are new, certain parts are simply efforts at installation or upgraded maintenance. When they had the first problem in July, they discovered that their auxiliary feed water piping, which is insulated piping, they were required in dealing with the stator problem to pull off some of the insulation, and they discovered corrosion in the auxiliary feed water pipes. No real surprise given how old the piping is, but they recognized that as a major problem and ended up taking the unit offline to replace those pipes. They figured that, well, if it happened in one of our units, we probably ought to check the pipes for the auxiliary feed water system in the other unit. They applied to the NRC for special permission to replace those pipes without taking the unit offline. And that's what called the attention of the Union of Concerned Scientists to the fact that there was a problem. That alerted us to the fact that there was a problem that could be traced back to the stator. As David said, the thing has been out for more than 2 months now. It's only been installed for a little over a year. PG&E's original rationale for why they needed to replace it was that they could suffer an outage with the old stator that might get up to as large as 100 days. Well, it's not going to be too long before they're at 100 days cumulative for this first year of operation. And the real question that PG&E management is going to have to face is, how much money are you willing to put in an old plant? And how much confidence do you want to have that the next round of refurbishment will be sufficient to correct the problem for the next 5 years? And that's a challenge that gets addressed each time new management comes in. As I think all of you know, there's a new CEO coming to PG&E in early January. She will be either the fourth or the fifth permanent CEO for the last 3 years, or in the last 3 years. There have been a couple of interim CEOs that probably ought to get added to that tally as well. But eventually, the decision of when the plant closes is going to be a decision that PG&E management makes. We've never had any illusion that the Public Utilities Commission or the NRC was going to tell PG&E to shut the plant. Ultimately, as was the case at Songs, the utility owner decides when it's just had enough. And I think, as we've told you before, this plant, ever since PG&E made the announcement in 2016 that it was abandoning relicensing, this plant has been operated in a run to failure mode. And I don't say that as a pejorative. That's an acceptable engineering approach for particular components when they don't threaten safety, that when the repair cost is too high, you just run that component to the point where it fails, and then you decide whether to replace it or not. This problem with the stator is quite likely in 2021 to raise the question writ large with respect to PG&E. Let me address a couple other things that we tried to deal with this year and found particularly disappointing. Probably the most prominent of those was our effort at the State Water Resources Control Board as it related to the extension of PG&E's compliance deadline for Unit 2 with the state's once-through cooling policy. The Water Resources Control Board had originally adopted deadlines in 2010 that would have required both Unit 1 and Unit 2 to cease their use of once-through cooling by December 31st, 2024. Rochelle was on the panel, the nuclear advisory panel, that the State Water Board assembled in reviewing the proposal for cooling towers or any other source of mitigation for the environmental damage those once-through cooling practices have caused in the ocean around Diablo Canyon. Never once was there any discussion of the deadline being anything other than December 31st, 2024. This turned up in the decommissioning proceeding in 2019 that we were participating in cross-examining one of PG&E's witnesses, Tom Jones, who I think most of you know, it's your local public relations flack for PG&E. Tom indicated that PG&E's lobbyist in Sacramento had been told by the State Water Resources Control Board staff that there was no problem extending the deadline. In fact, it wouldn't even require a public meeting on the part of the Water Resources Control Board. When we heard that, we went immediately to Sacramento, met with the individual staff person responsible, and he assured us that that was not the case whatsoever. PG&E's lobbyist had misquoted him. Of course, it would require a public meeting by the Water Resources Control Board, not to worry about anything. So earlier this year, the staff of the Water Resources Control Board swept up the Diablo deadline extension in their other recommendation, which was to extend the deadline for 4 plants in Southern California, 4 gas-fired plants, to abandon once-through cooling. And that has attracted quite a bit of media attention. The Diablo component attracted virtually none. What PG&E had persuaded the Water Board to do was to treat the Diablo extension as a technical correction to a known discrepancy in the earlier 2010 adopted policy. Their staff report didn't say much more than technical correction. So we went back, looked at the transcripts of the 2010 proceeding, found that PG&E had actually endorsed the December 31st, 2024 deadline. There's no mention of any technical discrepancy. We went through the entire Water Resource Control Board website, and there were several hundred mentions of Diablo Canyon in documents on their website. Not a single one ever addressed some technical discrepancy in the December 2024 deadline. We brought all of this to the attention of the full Water Resources Control Board on September 1st this year, when they held their session to evaluate the recommendation. And we thought that our concerns had registered during the meeting with a couple of the board members, but at the end of the meeting, they unanimously adopted the change anyway. I should say the one member who was not present was the only member who had been a member of the water board in 2010 when the original policy was adopted. And our remarks and a letter that Rochelle had sent to the full board earlier before their meeting didn't pull any punches about saying that there was something wrong here and that this was an abuse of process. I think, and I say this recognizing that the attorney-client privilege does not apply to these remarks, I think that the water board was reflecting the policy judgment of the governor's office that it was in the state's best interest to just push this deadline forward. My own belief, and I have no independent corroboration of that belief, but it is just a hunch that the IBW Local 1245, which represents many of the employees at the plant, has increased its influence in Sacramento executive branch thinking beyond what it had been previously, and that the state's deferential policy toward PG&E's wishes as it relates to the plant reflect that influence. We saw it earlier in the year in our participation in the PG&E bankruptcy proceeding. We had felt that it was only logical for a company in bankruptcy to seek to trim costs, and that one obvious cost was a nuclear plant that operates at an above market price that is more than $1.25 billion above what the cost of electricity would be if it were certainly purchased on the open market. So we thought that was a logical target for a company in bankruptcy looking to reduce its costs. We were told that those questions weren't really within the scope of the PUC's review of PG&E's bankruptcy plan. And it was made clear that that type of cost reduction would not be considered before the bankruptcy plan was approved. And I think when the governor switched on PG&E's bankruptcy plan, first he'd been very, very, very negative, and then ultimately he capitulated because he felt that it would be important for the governor's office to approve new board members, and that PG&E would be a better run company if the governor's office could only play a larger role in designating who its new management would be. The governor was successful in that. There is a new board. There soon will be a new CEO. Thus far, however, all of the indicators have been that state government is predisposed to rubber stamp PG&E requests, at least as it relates to bankruptcy and the operation of the Diablo Canyon plant. We're going to participate, we're participating now, and I'll be in hearings next week, the same kind of Zoom process, or actually it's WebEx that Rochelle described. You can log on your computer, but you have to call in on your phone because the most advanced technological society in the history of the world cannot figure out in their regulation of utilities how to make both audio and video work in the same system. We'll be participating in what's called the securitization proceeding, which is the bailout form of PG&E's bankruptcy plan. PG&E is requesting $7.5 billion be placed directly on ratepayer bills as something called securitization. We're opposed to that. We think that it would be much more sensible for PG&E to review large out-of-market costs like the $1.25 billion associated with Diablo Canyon in 2020 before turning to the ratepayers for a bailout. We also think that the bankruptcy plan that the PUC earlier approved will not permit this securitization proposal. And it remains to be seen what the PUC will ultimately decide. That decision will probably be in the first quarter of next year. The other case that we're likely to focus on next year has to do with this stator replacement. In February, PG&E will be required to file its cost justification for how it conducted day-to-day operations in 2020. So we will get access to all of the discovery materials associated with the July outage of the stator, the October outage of the stator, and this most recent November and December outage of the stator. And we'll be looking with a great deal of interest as to how PG&E justifies the way it's conducted itself. We'll also hold out great hope in 2021 that the new CEO at PG&E will take an independent look at all of their costs of operation, the financial pressures that the pandemic has put on them and has put on their ratepayers, and this new just approved Thursday rate increase, which will add $13.44 to the average ratepayer's bill every month in 2021. We think that an objective evaluation of the plant will lead to an early retirement announcement. But we've thought that before, and thus far, we've been proven wrong. I want to thank each and every one of you for your continued support and encouragement, because it's only through your continued urgings of our perseverance that we're able to function. And I have to tell you, it does make a big difference. I think eventually Sacramento is a responsive system of government, and ultimately the right decision will be made. It just hasn't happened yet.